Alright, welcome to another video tutorial. In this tutorial we're going to be building an entire responsive CSS and HTML5 menu without any JavaScript. So we're going to be looking at some fancy CSS tricks with some transitions, some media queries, and I hope you learned something, so come on in and join along. Focusing on just the pure responsive menu here, and it's going to be a menu that doesn't require any JavaScript or CSS. So the starting point files, you can look in the description and download these starting point. I also have the ending files if you want to take a look at exactly what it looks like in the end as well. So I'm just going to do a quick demo of what the menu looks like, and then we'll jump right into the code and get started. So here's what the menu looks like in its completed state. So you can see we have this little simple menu. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 buttons there. We have our little logo here on the left. And as we move the browser window down, so we're going to go down to a specific breakpoint. At this point, you can see it toggles into the Hamburger Menu. And when we come up into the Hamburger Menu, this is kind of a fun little thing here that we're going to design. But this is all done with CSS and CSS animations. But as we click the Hamburger Menu, it flies out. You can see we have now a stacked menu here. And it automatically turns into an X, and you can see there's a little bit of a transition there. So when I click this again, watch, you'll see this thing sort of animate back into the Hamburger Menu. When I click it again, it animates back into the mobile menu. So that's kind of the way this little thing works. And if I scale back up, it pops out. Also, what's nice here is if I scale down and I open the menu and I scale back up, it switches back correctly as well. So it's fully responsive. And there's no JavaScript. It's just done with a couple little CSS tricks with sibling selectors. So that's the finished product. And let's go ahead and get started on the beginning. Now, the opening files here are pretty blank. They just have, let me just squeeze this over here. There's just HTML. So the CSS file you can see for the starting point is completely empty. We're going to be doing the majority of our work in the CSS file for this responsive menu. And this is what our HTML is going to look like. So I'm just going to quickly cover the HTML. As we're going to be spending most of the time in CSS, I just want you to kind of look at the structure here. So this is a very basic HTML document. I don't even have a doc type. I just have an HTML tag, a very simple head tag just linking to our CSS file, and then a header tag. So the header, of course, is a new HTML5 tag. And then inside of the header, this is kind of where it gets important that you need to realize the structure here. So we have an anchor tag, that's just our logo that was on the left here. And then we have an input tag. So this is just a regular old checkbox. And this is what's going to enable us to click that little hamburger menu on and off. So there's a checkbox. And then right below that, we just have a label for that checkbox. And that label is going to be turned into the actual 3-line hamburger menu with CSS. So that's the two sort of magic things right there that are going to be the most important for our code. So then we just have a regular old unordered list with some list items as our actual menus with anchor tags, just like all the standard menus on the web. So that's kind of the way our structure looks. Header, a couple of tags, then an unordered list for the actual 4 items there. So let's jump over to the CSS and let's get started here. So I'm going to kind of pull this back a little bit as we're not going to be paying a lot of attention here to the structure. We're mostly going to be working in the CSS sheet so we can kind of see these side by side. So what we're going to do is just do some really basic styling to kind of make it not so boring. We'll add just a few basic grays so you can kind of see some of the menu style. So the first thing we're going to do is just come in here and do a new tag for the body. And we're going to set the margin to 0 to get rid of that default white margin around the body edges. And we're going to set our font family, and we'll just go with the Arial Helvetica one here. That should work fine now. And we'll set a background color of some light gray, so BBB. Okay, so we're going to save that and refresh over here, and you can see that that colorizes everything gray. So let's go ahead and add just a little simple rule here for our anchor tags. I'm not going to specifically order my CSS in a fancy way. We're just going to kind of go through it, and you can definitely rearrange your CSS as you want. But let's just set the color of our anchor tags to black. So that's 000 for our hex code. And we'll save that and refresh. So that looks fine there. Now I'm just switching back and forth. I'm doing Command Tab and refreshing. There are some plugins available for the code editor I'm using today. It's called VS Code. I'll link to that in the description as well. There are some plugins that do live reload. So as soon as you hit Command S, it'll automatically refresh your browser, and there's a few things like that. But I don't have those turned on today, as I'll just be switching back and forth. Okay, now let's flesh out the header. Now the header tag also has this class of header. If we jump over here to our HTML, you'll see that the header has a class of header. So I'm going to use that class to target this specific element. And let's just give it a background color so we can kind of see its dimensions. And we're just going to go with white, so FFF for our color. And then let's save and refresh. I'm going to kind of refresh each time so you can see the menu start to be built as we go here. And I'm actually going to zoom in a couple of clicks there on the browser so you can see that a little bit better as well. Okay, next let's give this guy a box shadow. And so the box shadow property has the horizontal, the vertical, the blur, and the color values. So we'll start off with just a 1 pixel, and then we're going to do a blur of 4 pixels, and then 0 for the spread, and then RGBA. So instead of declaring a hex code like we did right here in this property, we're going to be declaring this one with red, green, blue, alpha. This allows us to give our box shadow a transparency, so that alpha value. So that's why I like to do this for shadows. And the color is just going to be black. So it's 0, 0, 0, 0 red, 0 green, 0 blue, comma, and then we'll just say 0.1, which is basically 10% transparency. So that will do it for that. So let's save and refresh. Now it's going to be pretty subtle here, but that added a shadow right under there. You can kind of see it along the bottom edge, that 1 pixel by 1 pixel shadow. All right, next we're going to fix position this menu. So we're going to position this guy, whoops, spelled that wrong. Position fixed. That's going to anchor our menu at the top, fixed positioning. And we're going to give it a width of 100%. So it stretches, and we're going to give this guy a z-index right now of, let's just say 3, because we want it to be above the content. If we had content later on and we scroll, we want that content to slide underneath our menu. So that's why we're going to give our header a higher z-index so that it kind of appears in the stacking order on top. So that's pretty much it for the header tag. And now let's move down and work with the actual menu items here. So the menu, and there's our checkbox you can see. That's the input tag. So let's jump down there and add those. So next is going to be a header, UL. So this is the unordered list that's inside of the header. In other words, the actual main menu. So let's just set the margin to 0 and the padding to 0. And you can see when I refresh there, that gets rid of the margin and padding. Now, even though we can't see the bullets in this specific menu, they actually are still there. So we need to turn off the bullets as well. And we do that with a property called list style. So we're going to set list style to none. That basically turns off bullets or numbers, whatever the listing is. And we're going to set our overflow property to hidden, so that if anything flows out of bounds, it'll just be hidden. And we don't necessarily need this, but I'll set the background color to white as well, just in case you wanted to, for some reason, change the color of your menu. I suppose later you could. But we'll just leave it as white, same as our header for now. Okay, let's refresh over here. That's looking fine. Next, we're going to be styling each of the individual anchor tags within the menu. So we're going to do a new rule for header UL A. Excuse me. I got a little bit of a hoarse voice today. So we're going to set this guy to display block. In other words, our anchor tags are going to be block level elements. The reason we do this is an anchor tag by default is an inline element. So it doesn't have padding and margins. And what that means is if you were to hover your mouse over the menu, notice how that I can click on this element even though I'm clear over here. So if this was not display block, notice that when I hover my mouse over here, I can't click that. You have to be exactly on the words in order to click an anchor tag. So by setting that display block, we allow ourselves some padding or some margin in order to click on that button. So that's kind of the purpose of the display block. Next, we're going to just give this guy some padding. So this will pad out each of these. And just so you can kind of see what's going on, before I do this, I'm going to turn on outline so you can kind of see it happening in the browser window there. So 1 pixel solid red, we'll just say for now, and refresh. And you can see all those guys are now outlined in red. So now we can go ahead and turn on the padding of 20 pixels. That's the top and the, well, let's just leave it at 20 pixels all the way around. So that adds 20 pixels on the top, right, bottom, and left to all sides. And now we're going to give this guy a border just on the right side of 1 pixel solid. And I don't know, we'll just go with, I don't want to have that same color. Let's go with AAA. So just kind of a little bit of a gray. Now, what this is going to do, you can't see it now, but that added a 1 pixel border on the right edge of each of these anchor tags. Now, right now, our menu is stacked, but in a desktop view, that's going to add a little divider in between each of our elements. You'll see that here in a second once we add the code to make these guys spread out instead of stack. So that will pretty much do it. We do want to get rid of the underline on anchor tags because this is inside of a menu. So we're going to set the text decoration to none. That will remove all the default underlines of those elements. I'm going to leave this outline on here just for a minute. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to take this logo element and float it to the left of our menu so that it floats left. So we're going to say dot header dot logo, dot logo, and we're going to float left. We'll set the display to block, which actually probably is not going to do anything. Font size of 2 Ms. So that's just going to be, probably 32 point if your browser default is set to 16, which most browsers are. And we'll give it some padding. Let's just go with maybe 10 pixels on the top and bottom and 20 pixels on the left and right. Okay, let's save and refresh so you can kind of see that. So there's our logo, and it's a lot bigger, you can see, and has a little bit of padding, and it's floating over to the left. So that should probably do it there. Let's go ahead in between these two rules. We're going to add a hover state next for our list items, or not our list items, our anchor tags. So we're going to say dot header ul anchor : hover. So this will affect, again, this isn't necessarily a rule on CSS selectors, a video rather, I have some other videos on that. But this is going to affect the hover of anchor tags that are children of unordered lists that are children of an element with the class of header. So that's kind of the way you read those from right to left. At least that's the way I like to read them. And let's go ahead and just change the background color. And I don't know, let's go to maybe DDD. So let's test that out. So we'll come over here and refresh. And you can see now when I hover over their menu items, I'm getting that background color. And again, I can click anywhere on this entire anchor tag. That's because of the display block. So that's working fine now. And I think that's probably good for now. Let's go ahead and keep moving on down here. All right, now because we're designing a mobile first approach, we're going to be designing our mobile menu first, and then we'll kind of do the desktop versions as we expand out. So let's go ahead and add another rule here. This is going to be for our header and then the menu. So the actual unordered list tag. So we're going to say clear both. And let's save and refresh to show you what that does. That forces the menu to be cleared below the left floated title, corp words. So because we floated that left, we need to clear the menu. So that works fine there. And we're going to set, this is going to come into play a little bit later, but we're going to set a max height of 0 on this menu. And then we're going to set a transition of max height, and 0.2 seconds, and we're going to do an ease out. So this is the actual animation. So in other words, when I click the mobile menu, this menu is going to collapse and expand, but it's going to have a little bit of an animation. So that's why we need the max height property here of 0. Now you can see when I refresh, because this is on a mobile menu, it should be closed by default. So by setting max height to 0, our menu is essentially doesn't exist. When we click our little button, we're going to set the max height to expand, so then it will animate out. So that's kind of the thought here. So I'll leave that max height at 0 for now, but that's why we put that in there. Okay, next we're going to work on these little menu icons here. So we have our checkbox. This guy is going to become listed over here on the right side of our page, and we're going to transform it so that it has these 3 bars. We're going to use a whole bunch of fancy CSS tricks to do that. So let's start working on those elements. If you recall, I'm going to be using all their class names, but you can look at your HTML. So this input, the actual checkbox, has an ID of menu button, and the actual label has a class of menu icon. This guy has a class of menu button as well. So we're going to be using these 2 classes specifically to style this guy. And then over here, one more, this span class in the middle is has a class of nav icon. So you can kind of see which elements we're targeting based on those classes. So let's jump back over here and we'll start to do this. So we're going to start with the actual menu icon. So we're going to say dot header space dot menu dash icon. So just so you're aware, again, the menu icon is the span that is inside of the label. Okay. So let's jump over here. So we're gonna give this guy a let's give it an outline so you can kind of see this. 1 pixel solid red, and we'll save and refresh that. You can't really see it, right? It's right there, little teeny tiny nothing right now, but that's where it's at. So we're gonna give it some padding. So we're gonna say padding 28 pixels by 20 pixels, and refresh. And now you can definitely see it. So now we have some padding inside of there. That's our little box. If I switch outline to border, maybe we'll be able to see that top element. I guess we can, it's right off screen. That's fine. Next, we're going to give this guy a position of relative, because we're going to be, the reason why we give this a position of relative, because this is acting as the parent container for the span. We're going to be moving the span and doing some designs with absolute positioning. So we need to have the parent container have a position of relative so we can use absolute positioning on its child elements here in a minute. So that's why we give that guy a position. If you have questions on CSS positioning, I have 3 or 4 videos on CSS positioning. I'll probably put links to those as it's kind of a lengthy topic. But let's go ahead and keep moving here. So let's, I think that's pretty much all we need on there. So now let's move down, and we're going to work on the styles next that are for the, so it's going to be dot menu icon dot nav icon. So once I get this in here, let's just go look at our HTML so you can see which element we're working on. So this label is the parent. You can see it starts there and it ends over here. And now we're going to be working on this child, which is the span, which has the class of nav icon. So this is the element we're now styling. So let's jump back here and add some code to this. So for our nav icon, we're going to give it a background. So let's just say background, and we're going to make it something dark, like just a dark gray, something like that. So I'm going to save and refresh so you can kind of see this as I go. You can't see anything yet because there's no dimensions to this guy. So let's go ahead and give it a display. Span tags by default are display of inline, so we need to switch that to say display of block so that we can give it some width and height and it'll work. And let's give it a height of 2 pixels and a width of 18 pixels. And you'll see here when I refresh now what this did. It kind of looks broken now, but this little teeny tiny bar right there is what we created. So it's just a little bar of 2 by 18 with the background color of a dark gray. So that's what we created by doing those couple of rules there. Now we're going to give it a position of relative as well. And whoops, got to jump back over here. And we're going to be animating this guy a little bit later on. So I'm going to add the transition right now. but we're going to transition the background. This will all make sense. I'll explain it here in a second. 0.2 seconds, and the same thing we did before, an ease out animation. And that bar eventually is going to become 3 bars, and we're going to animate those bars to do a 3D rotation with CSS. That's why we're adding the transition here right now. But we'll actually see that come into play here in a minute. So let's see. I think that's all we need on this guy for right now. So let's jump down here and do the next little piece. So now we're going to take this little bar and we're going to add its top and bottom halves. So we're going to be using pseudo elements to do this. So pseudo elements are one of those things that are just super cool and very powerful. So I'll add all the classes here. So this is the menu icon, and we're going to be affecting the same element. So it's the nav dash icon, but we're going to be using the before pseudo element first. Now I could actually group these into a single one, but I'm just going to keep them separate for now. So let's go ahead and, oh, this thing's actually turning green. I don't know why that's squawking at me. Oh, because I have empty rules. All right. So same thing. We're going to give it a background of that same color as before. We're going to set the content to nothing. This is going to allow us to add the bars via CSS programmatically here in a minute. And we're going to say display block. We're going to set the height to 100% so that it's the same height as its original. And here's the trick. We're going to set position to absolute on this before pseudo selector. Okay. And we're going to set the width. I guess I should have done this up here so it makes more sense. The width, if I can type that, of 100% as well. Position of absolute. And then that is all we need for right now. So I'm going to save and I'm going to refresh this. So what that did is it added another element, another pseudo element in exactly the same place as the first one because we did position of absolute and we haven't moved it yet. So it's basically height and width is 100%. Well, that means it's 2 pixels height and 18 pixels as far as the width goes. So now we can offset this guy and move it. So we're going to set the top to 5 pixels. Okay, and save, and now watch what happens when I refresh. I'm going to zoom in here. So I'm going to refresh and see how that added my second bar for the hamburger menu. So in other words, top 5 pixels means it moved down 5 pixels from the top of where it was normally positioned with absolute positioning, and it stuck it right there. So basically I'm going to copy this exact same rule. So I'm going to copy everything in here. I'm going to paste it right below this. And again, here's where I could probably leverage a group selector to not have so much redundant code, but I'm not going to. And we will switch this before to an after. So pseudo elements have 2 pseudo elements. There's always a before and an after, and that's all there is. So now that I'm going to use the after one, I'm going to do the exact opposite. I'm going to shift it -5 pixels to move it above the original one 5 pixels. Again, so let's zoom in here and we'll refresh. And you can see that added now my third bar. So that's how you build a basic, simple hamburger menu with just CSS. You just use 2 pseudo elements, shift one up, shift one down, and you're off to the races. And because we used pure CSS for this, we'll be able to animate those bars here in a minute and do a cool little transition. So that is our hamburger menu now set to where we want. And because we will be animating these bars here in a minute, again, I'm going to add the transition right now. So we'll set transition to all 0.2 seconds, just like we've done before, and ease out. And I'm going to copy this rule down here to my after, whoops, undo whatever I did, my after element as well. So now we'll be able to animate these guys. Okay, now this little checkbox over here, we want that to disappear. So we don't want to have a checkbox here. The only reason we have this is so that we have an element we can click, because you can't click on a span tag, right? But in an input tag you can click on, and it also is accessible. So building your responsive menu this way, it has a much higher degree of accessibility than like doing some weird jQuery hiding and showing of menu elements as well. So that's our next goal. We need to get rid of this little guy right here. So if you recall, let's jump over here to our HTML. That little checkbox is inside of an input, and it has the class of menu button and also has the ID of menu button, but we're going to be using the class. So back to our CSS, we'll do a new rule here. It's going to be dot header menu dash btn, and we're just going to say display of none because we don't want that guy there. So let's save and refresh, and now that makes our little checkbox disappear just like we want. Okay, one thing we need to just fix up here. So we want to get this little guy, our little hamburger menu, over here on the right side. So let's do that. We're going to come up here to our header menu icon, and we're going to float him to the right. So, whoops. I can switch over here to Firefox. There we go. And refresh. So now that guy's floated there over to the right, we probably should have done that a long time ago. It would have been easier to see than jammed over here against the logo. But you can see that little menu guy. So when I hover my mouse over the menu, I'm just getting the default arrow and not the hand, the pointer. So we need to also change that right here. So let's go ahead and just set this guy to have a cursor of pointer. And now when we refresh over here, you can see that I hover over here and I'm actually getting the pointer so that I can click on this guy. So that's looking pretty good. We can now delete the border. That was just so you can kind of see where that guy is. So let's delete out that border and refresh. So things are looking pretty nice. So let's go ahead and come down here to the bottom. And now we're going to be adding quite a bit of CSS to do this little magic transition so that we get our X to appear when we click on our mobile menu. So there's some fancy things in here, and let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so let's write a new rule for the header. And this is going to be when our menu is checked. And I'll explain this selector in a minute because it's kind of a complicated selector. So menu btn colon checked sibling dot menu. Okay. So here's where I'm going to change the max height. This is finally going to make our menu expand to 240 pixels. So let's explain this little selector here. So I'm now clicking my menu and you can see it actually now finally works. I can click the menu, my menu shrinks, I can click the menu and my menu expands. Now the reason why this works is kind of a little bit tricky, but you have to remember the max height is affecting it. It's always the last element, right? So the class of .menu, if we go look at our HTML again, that's the actual unordered list. So we're changing the height of the UL, which is why it's going big. Now it's automatically animating because if you recall, clear up here on our menu, we added a transition of max height. So we already have the transition set up in the original selector. That's why down here on our selector here in the pseudo selector for checked, it's animating, okay? Just to prove this to you, I'm gonna invalidate this, so I'll hit X here, come over here and refresh. So it's gonna just appear and disappear in this case. So it appears and disappears and appears and disappears. In other words, max height 0, max height 240. And in order to make that transition smooth is when we add the transition so that now it animates. Okay, so that's why that thing is actually animating out. And you can see there's a little bit of easing in there. It's not a linear motion. It kind of slows down a little bit. So that's what the ease out does. It slows near the end. So let's explain this selector. So this checked is of course a pseudo selector. It's kind of like the hover. So what this means is when the menu button is in its checked state, okay, let's go back and look and see what menu button is. So menu button is the input tag. So remember the input tag is still right here, it's just hidden. So the reason why this works is a little bit convoluted, but I want to really demo this so you can grasp what's happening here. It's kind of a tricky thing. So I'm going to do this way down here below this header to demonstrate it. So I'm going to set up a label, and this label is going to be for, and I'm just going to say blah, my favorite thing. And so we'll say label here. Okay, and then below this, I'm going to set up an input of type equals checkbox. So this is basically exactly the way our menu is working here. And an ID of blah and a name. I guess we don't need a name. We'll just leave it like that. Okay, so let's save and refresh here. And oh shoot, we can't see this because it's underneath, because this is position fixed. This guy's actually up underneath there. Let's do a bunch of break tags. This maybe will fix this problem. Let's see if we can get this guy to come down. There we go. So the way this works, the way that HTML forms work is, of course, if you have a checkbox, you can actually click the checkbox itself in order to toggle the checked and non-checked state. But you can also click the label. So if you click the label, it will also toggle the checked and non-checked state. And this is the real magic here. So this only works if your for attribute, for equals blah, matches up with the ID of the input tag. So that's what sort of connects this label with this input, allowing you to click the label. So what we did in our menu is essentially we hid the checkbox, and then we didn't have any text in our label. Instead, we made that 3 bars. So our label is essentially a 3-bar CSS trick. So when I click those 3 label bars, it's toggling the checked state of this input field. And that's exactly what we're doing up here. So I'm going to delete this now so you can kind of see what's going on here. So now in our code, when the menu is in its checked state, look for the next available sibling that has a class of menu and change its max height to 240. So let's look at our HTML here. Right? This is kind of the whole crux of this entire trick. So I want to really explain this. So when our input is in a checked state, so in other words, when I click on this, it's in a checked state. That little squiggly tilde is a sibling selector. It will select the next sibling. So you can see that anchor, input, label, and UL, these are all siblings to one another. So it will select the next sibling with that class of menu, and we're changing its height. So in other words, we're changing the menu based on the click from the input label. So there you go. So anyway, that's what's happening there. That's how this selector works. So that sibling selector does all the magic. Okay, let's move down here. So what we're now going to do is use that same trick to animate our label, our hamburger menu essentially. So we're going to write another rule. So this one's going to be for header. Probably can just copy and paste here. That's going to be all the same. So let's copy all of this. So header, menu button checked, sibling. This time we're going to use the sibling of menu icon. And dot nav icon. Now I'm going to set up the selectors all first, and then I'll start adding in the actual CSS. Okay, so there's one. I'm going to copy this, and we're going to do this essentially 2 more times. 1, 2, 3. So we have the nav icon, and then we're going to use the nav icon before and the nav icon after. Remember, we've already set these guys up earlier. So we're using the before and after right here to actually create our 3 bars, right? So now we're essentially going to override those 2 rules when the menu button is checked. So this is where the sibling class comes in. So this is kind of really confusing to read, but this is where things get complicated in CSS. We're affecting the nav icon. This is the span tag in its before pseudo element if it's a child of a menu icon class. That's the actual label, which is a sibling of a menu button in its check state. That's a child of a header class, right? So anyway, convoluted CSS rule, but it will work for us. So what we're going to do is we're going to say transform, and we're going to rotate this guy -45 degrees. Okay, And let's just save and refresh and you'll see what happens here. So see how that guy rotated 45 degrees. And now I'm going to copy this rule. And remember, he's rotated right now because he's in the checked state. If I click this, this is in the unchecked state, so it's not rotated. So when I click it, it's in the checked state. So I'll leave that open there. I'm going to paste this guy, and this guy is going to be a positive 45 degrees for the aft or pseudo selector, which is the top one. So now we'll rotate that, and that goes like that. Now the problem is when you're rotating these guys with CSS, it always rotates from the center, right? And that definitely does not look like an X. And that's because you have two bars right here and they're both rotating from the center. So you're getting sort of this effect like this. So we need these bars to be exactly in front of one another. So when you rotate from the center, you get the X instead of spaced where it looks like this. So we need to change the CSS positioning to move those guys down. So let's jump back over here. And what we're going to do is just set top. So remember before we said we set top to -5 and +5. Let's just set it to 0 to make it right in the middle. And you can see when I refresh, that's going to move that guy right up. And when I set the bottom one, or the top one to top of 0 and refresh, that's going to move that guy right down. So now I have an X. So now the problem is, of course, my middle bar I don't want. So what we're going to come up here on this last menu, and we're just going to set the background. Remember that middle bar is appearing because it's a background color. Let's just set it to transparent so it disappears. So now when I refresh, now it's gone. So that's how we kind of do that trick to make the X. So you can see when I click, it's got my 3 bars, and when I click, it turns itself into an X. So that's kind of the magic there for doing this little animation. So now what I want is I can actually add the transition to make that guy animate. And we're going to do that up inside of, oh, I already have that in there. Okay, I've discovered the issue. So the problem, I paused that for a second, but the problem was I had 0.2 right here and I didn't have 0.2 seconds. So there, I was missing my unit of measure on my 0.2, and I had that issue on both of these rules. So if you're following along, fix that. So that one should be 0.2s and that should be 0.2s. This guy has a transition of the background. These both have transition of all. So with that little fix, let's go ahead and refresh over here and you can see how this is going to work. So I'll zoom in here. So let's click the button and it actually does the animation now, right? So you can see it animate and animate, and you get this really nice little transition, all built with pure CSS for a fully responsive menu. So really, we're almost done here. I know this is kind of a lengthy video, but we're down to the home stretch. So the last little bit we need to do is just make it so that our menu responds on a MediaQuery. So, because this is the mobile version, right? But if I keep going wider and wider and wider, my menu is forever mobile. So let's go ahead and get rid of those. Actually, I'm going to leave the borders there for just a second. We'll turn off those red lines in a minute here. But that's pretty much it for the menu. So now we just have a couple little bit of work to do on our MediaQuery, and we're done. So we'll create a MediaQuery here. So at media, and this is going to be a min width of 48 ems. Now you could do whatever value you want here. This is essentially your breakpoint, right? But 48 ems, if you have a 16-point font, is 768 pixels, which is basically iPad sort of tablet resolution. So that's, I'm just going to add one simple MediaQuery here to do this. So we'll write some overrides in here. So again, we're building now our desktop version of the menu. So I'm going to make sure that my screen is wide enough to accommodate 768. In fact, I'm going to switch into the developer mode in Firefox so I can resize this without messing with my browser windows here. Okay, so you can see the resolution up here. It shows me my current pixels, so I can see 768. I'm above it right there. Okay, so let's go ahead and do this. So header li, so this is all the list items in the menu. Instead of having them be stacked, which is block, I'm going to float them all left. So I'm going to say float left. Okay, I'll save and refresh. I'll do this slowly. So now they're all sort of stacking horizontally instead of vertically. And we'll do another rule here. This is going to be for our header LIA. So all of our anchor tags, we'll mess around with the padding. I think originally it was just 20 pixels all the way around. So here we'll do 20 pixels on the top and bottom and 30 pixels on the left and right. So let's refresh that. So it spaces them apart just a little bit more horizontally on the desktop menu. And then we're going to say header.menu. So this is the actual unordered list tag here. We're going to set the clear to none, and we're going to float the entire thing right. So because we had clear left before, which is why it's down below this, because this is floated left. Now that we have clear none and we're floating it right, it sticks it over on the right hand side of our header section, I suppose, our menu. And we're going to set the max height to none because we had the max height set to that little override 0 or 240 before. So we'll just override that and clear that value out. And this is our last rule. We're going to set the header menu icon because, right, we don't want this little menu up here on a desktop. So we're just going to say display none. And now let's save and refresh. So that gets rid of our little X. Let's go ahead and get rid of that red now that we added way up here on our elements. So let's just get rid of the red and save and refresh. And you can see the little divider there. So we still have our hover states. That border right now is showing up to separate these guys. I can expand and then watch what happens when I go down to menu, mobile rather. Let's actually collapse that and show you. So here it is. So you can watch this as soon as I hit 768 here on this width value, it should hit our MediaQuery for our breakpoint. So we'll start to scale down right there, 768, it breaks. So then we're now down to our mobile menu. We have our animation, everything slides out, our hovers all work. Slide all the way down, slide all the way up. There it breaks back to desktop. So that's pretty much it for this tutorial. I know it was kind of lengthy, but it's a very cool trick in order to build a fully responsive menu with no JavaScript. It gracefully degrades. There's no JavaScript. It's better for accessibility. We have the ability to do cool animations with CSS and a few tricks. So anyway, this is a really popular menu. I've seen it all over the place on the web in lots and lots of websites. So it's kind of fun. Hope you learned something. Fill out some comments. If you have questions, I'd love to see any links for your menus that you've created using this technique and your kind of spin on them if you sort of customize it your own way. And we will see you in the next one. All right.